The harsh reality of finding a job in Australia, Part 3. When I arrived in Australia, I thought the hardest part was leaving my home behind. I thought I had already survived the worst. I was wrong. Because the real struggle began when I started looking for a job. I had no savings, no financial support, and a mountain of debt waiting for me back home. My tuition was being covered by a sponsor, but my living expenses, rent, food, everything else was on me. I needed a job, and I needed one fast. The endless rejections, I applied to every job I could find. Restaurants, cafes, retail stores, warehouses. It didn't matter what the job was, I just needed someone to give me a chance. But rejection became a part of my daily routine. Every job application ended the same way. We regret to inform you, you're not the right fit at this time. We require full-time availability. No one wanted to hire a student with work-hour restrictions. My visa only allowed me to work 20 hours a week, and for most employers that wasn't enough. Even the jobs that claimed to be student-friendly had unrealistic expectations. They wanted flexibility that I couldn't provide. They needed employees who could work overtime, who could be available on short notice, things that weren't possible for someone balancing university studies and survival. The few interviews I did get led nowhere. They would take one look at my student visa and lose interest. Some even told me to my face, "We prefer someone who can work full-time. Come back after you graduate." But I couldn't wait. I had rent to pay, I had food to buy, I had loans piling up back home. I needed to find something, anything to make ends meet. No car, no opportunities. Another major setback? I didn't have a car. In Australia, so many jobs required their employees to have their own transport. Delivery jobs, warehouse shifts, trade jobs. Almost every decent paying position asked for a car. Even if the work itself didn't require driving, employers still preferred people who could get to locations on their own without relying on public transport. And public transport, it wasn't always reliable. Some job sites were too far away. Some shifts started too early or ended too late when buses and trains weren't even running. I lost multiple job opportunities just because I couldn't afford a vehicle. It was like every door was being slammed in my face before I even had the chance to prove myself. Getting exploited and scammed. That's when I started becoming desperate. And desperation makes you vulnerable. I didn't know it then, but when you're struggling to find work, there are people out there who take advantage of that desperation. And I became their perfect target. The fake job that broke me one day, I came across a job listing for what I thought was a car mechanic assistant. The ad made it seem like they were hiring people to help with car servicing and maintenance. I didn't have experience, but I was willing to learn. So I applied, and to my surprise, I got the job almost immediately. No interview, no background check, just a simple come in tomorrow and we'll get you started. At the time, I was just relieved to finally have work. I didn't ask questions, but it didn't take me long to realize that this was not a mechanic job. Instead of fixing cars, they handed me a stack of cheap-looking car maintenance vouchers and told me to go out and sell them in parking lots. At first, I didn't understand. They said these vouchers gave people discounts on car servicing. They told me it was a great deal, so I went along with it. I spent hours walking through parking lots, stopping random people, convincing them to buy these vouchers. I told them they would save money. I told them it was a legitimate service. But something felt off. People who bought the vouchers often came back confused, saying the mechanics didn't accept them or that the services were never available. When I asked my supervisor about it, he brushed it off. He told me not to worry. But the final straw came when I saw my colleague, a more experienced seller, ripping off an old lady. She was a pensioner, someone who barely had enough money to get by. I watched as my colleague sweet-talked her into buying multiple vouchers, promising her they would save her hundreds of dollars. She hesitated, saying she didn't have money at the moment. And then I saw something that made my stomach turn. My colleague pressured her to transfer the money as soon as she got her pension. For 3 days straight, she followed up with her, calling her repeatedly, making sure she transferred the payment. I couldn't take it anymore. I finally realized I wasn't working for an honest company. I was scamming people. The job I had been so desperate to get, the job I thought would help me survive, was nothing more than a shady multi-level marketing scheme designed to rip people off. I felt sick. I felt like a fraud, and I knew, no matter how broke I was, I couldn't do this anymore. So I walked away. Hopeless and lost, I quit that job, but I didn't have another one waiting for me. I was back to square one, broke, unemployed, and struggling to find a way forward. The stress of everything weighed on me. The constant rejections, the financial pressure, the feeling of being completely alone in a foreign country. I had never felt so lost in my life. At times I wondered if coming to Australia was a mistake. I had left my home, my family, my love, everything, for what? To be treated like I didn't belong? To struggle every single day just to survive? I had come here hoping to make a better future, but instead I was drowning in stress, failure and regret. After walking away from that shady job, I thought I had finally escaped, but the company wasn't done with me yet. The next day I got a call from my so-called manager. He wasn't angry that I left. Instead, he acted friendly, almost too friendly. "You're a smart guy," he said. "You have potential. Don't let this opportunity slip away." I didn't respond. I had already made up my mind. But then he dropped something that made my stomach turn. "You don't have to sell on the streets anymore. Why not sell to people you know, your friends, your family in Australia? Surely they'd be interested in saving money on car servicing." And that's when I finally understood. It was never about the product. It was never about helping people. It was all about recruiting more sellers, more victims, and trapping them in the cycle. This wasn't just a scam, it was a pyramid scheme. For the first time, I saw how these companies preyed on desperate people. They didn't care who they hurt, as long as they made money. I had almost become one of them. I hung up the phone and blocked the number. For days after that, I kept looking over my shoulder, afraid I would run into someone from that company. I had wasted weeks of my life selling lies, and I had nothing to show for it except guilt and frustration. But I couldn't afford to sit around. I still needed a job. And that's when I found the poultry factory. When I applied for a job at the poultry factory, I thought, finally, maybe this time I'd get something stable, something that wouldn't break my body. It was an admin position, office work, something where I could use my education instead of my physical strength. For once, I felt hopeful. I dressed my best, printed out extra copies of my resume, and walked into that factory with confidence. But the moment I stepped inside, something felt off. The manager barely glanced at my resume. "You'll be handling some calls," he said casually. "Just helping out in sales. That wasn't what I applied for." I hesitated. "Sales? I thought this was for an admin role." Yeah, he waved me off. "It's all part of it." I should have known right then. But I was desperate. I needed a job. So I convinced myself, maybe it's just temporary. Maybe it's just a small part of the role. I was wrong. They gave me a script and a headset. "Start calling these numbers," a supervisor said. I looked down at the list. Hundreds of names. People who had probably never heard of this company before. I was expected to cold call them and convince them to buy poultry products. I had never done this kind of work before. And the worst part? I wasn't even given proper training. They just threw me in. I stumbled through the first few calls, my voice unsure, my hands sweating. Most people hung up on me. Some were rude. Others were confused, asking, "Why are you calling me? I never signed up for this." I had no answer. This wasn't what I was supposed to be doing. At lunch, I sat with a few of the other employees, trying to figure out what was going on. That's when I learned the truth. One of them leaned in and whispered, "You're replacing someone, but don't get too comfortable. They'll never make it official." "What do you mean?" I asked. "The guy you're covering for is on leave. They just needed someone to fill in. They're not planning to hire you permanently." My stomach dropped. I thought this was a real opportunity, a chance to build something stable, but I was nothing more than a temporary placeholder. I waited for them to discuss my contract, but every time I brought it up, they avoided the question. "We'll talk about that later. Let's see how things go first. Just focus on work for now." The days passed and I realized there was no contract. There never was. By the third day, I had enough. I wasn't going to let another company waste my time and treat me like I was disposable. I walked straight into the manager's office. "I need to talk about my contract." He looked annoyed. "Look, we're still figuring things out. You need to be patient." "No, either I get a proper contract or I walk." He sighed, leaned back in his chair and said, "If you're this impatient, maybe this isn't the place for you." I stared at him for a moment and then I stood up. "You're right, this isn't the place for me," and I walked out. I should have felt angry. I should have been furious that they wasted my time, that they tricked me into taking a role I never wanted. But instead, all I felt was exhausted, because this wasn't the first time, and deep down I knew it wouldn't be the last. Finding a job in Australia as a student wasn't just hard, it was a game A game where the rules were always stacked against me. I was tired of losing, but I had no choice. So I kept searching, kept applying, kept hoping that one day I'd find something real. If I thought the poultry factory was bad, I had no idea what was waiting for me. The next job I got, it would push me past my limits. It would make me question everything. And for the first time, I would wonder if coming to Australia was the biggest mistake of my life. 6 months of struggle, and finally finding a warehouse job. 6 months passed. I had graduated, but I was still stuck in survival mode. By now, I had been rejected hundreds of times. I had sent out job applications every day, hoping anyone would give me a chance, but employers still preferred people with permanent residency. My student visa status made things harder, even though I was now legally allowed to work full-time. I was losing hope, until one day I got a call from a warehouse job. It wasn't an office job. It wasn't anything close to what I had dreamed of, but it was stable. I didn't ask questions, I just said yes. The warehouse job, the hardest work I've ever done. The warehouse was massive, a giant space filled with towering shelves, forklifts speeding past, and workers moving non-stop. My job? Heavy lifting. For 10 hours a day, I moved boxes, stacked pallets, loaded trucks, and did whatever the supervisors told me to do. Some boxes weighed over 30 kilograms. There were no breaks except for lunch. And the worst part? The heat. During summer, the warehouse turned into a furnace. Temperatures reached 40 DC and there was no air conditioning. The only relief was the occasional industrial fan, but it did little against the heat. I remember one shift where I felt like I was going to collapse. My clothes were drenched in sweat, my muscles burned, and every breath felt heavy, but I couldn't stop. If I slowed down, the supervisors would yell. If I took too long, I risked losing my job, so I pushed through even when my body begged me to stop. By the time I got home every night, I was too exhausted to do anything. I would eat whatever I had left in my fridge, take a shower, and pass out on my bed. Then, I'd wake up and do it all over again. This was my life. And after everything, after struggling to find a job, after working in the freezing cold of the poultry factory, after getting scammed in a pyramid scheme, after suffering in the heat of the warehouse, I finally asked myself the question I had been avoiding. Was coming to Australia worth it? The reality of being an international student back home, people thought Australia was a dream, they thought life here was easy, that once you arrived, everything just worked out. But the truth? The struggle never stops. International students don't just study, we work harder than anyone. We take whatever jobs we can, no matter how bad they are. We fight against the system, against the restrictions, against the odds, all for a chance at a better future. But what if that future never comes? What if all this sacrifice leads to nothing? These were the questions that haunted me every single day. But I wasn't done fighting yet, because my story didn't end there. It was just getting started. In the next video, I'll talk about the emotional toll of this journey, how the stress, loneliness, and exhaustion started affecting my mental health. I'll share the hardest moment of my life, the moment I almost gave up. But I'll also talk about what kept me going, because even in the darkest times, there's always a glimmer of hope.